Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
It started the way it always did: mashed potatoes, glazed ham, two sweet yams, and conversations so surface level they could skim across a pond without ever sinking. Thanksgiving at Aunt Carol's house had always felt more like a photo shoot than a holiday. Every room was perfectly decorated, every serving dish matched, and every wine glass had to be held with fingers curled, just so, because God forbid someone snapped a candid that didn't look like it belonged in better homes and gardens. And for the past 20 years, I'd played along, showing up with a polite smile and a homemade pie that was never touched. Carol always served her store-bought pecan pie in a crystal dish and claimed it was Grandma's old recipe. I stopped correcting her somewhere around 2013. This year felt different the moment I walked in the door. The air was too sweet with cinnamon candles and artificial warmth, like it was trying too hard to be comforting. My mom greeted me first, doing her usual quick once-over to make sure my clothes weren't wrinkled, my face was done, and I wasn't looking too tired. I had on a navy wool dress, subtle gold jewelry, and boots that cost more than Aunt Carol's entire centerpiece, but to Mom, I was always one accessory away from being a little plain. Emily arrived 5 minutes after me, laughing too loudly before she even stepped inside. She wore a beige coat with a fur collar and carried a Louis Vuitton bag she'd probably financed, and behind her, Tyler trailed like a cologne cloud in human form. He kissed Carol on the cheek, gave me a nod that felt more like an approval rating than a hello, and made a show of removing his sunglasses indoors, like we were at some kind of press conference. As usual, Carol lit up like a Christmas tree when Emily walked in, grabbing her hand and pulling her into the kitchen to catch up, even though they talked on the phone at least twice a week. That left me and my glass of white wine sitting on the couch across from my cousin's wife, who was trying to keep her toddler from eating a candle. I watched them for a while, Emily gesturing dramatically with her freshly manicured hands, Carol covering her mouth as she gasped at whatever perfect story was being fed to her, and Mom peeking in every so often with that tight smile that always meant, "I hope you're taking notes." And that's when I realized these people didn't actually know anything about me. To them, I was the quiet one. The one who never brought a date, never posted vacations, never had dramatic news to share. I was Rachel. Dependable, dull, childless, single, and suspiciously content. And they hated that content part more than they'd ever admit. Because nothing infuriates people more than someone who is silently winning their own race without announcing the laps. Dinner was served at 6, as always. Carol gave her usual toast about gratitude and family, while Tyler raised his glass like he was at a shareholders meeting. Emily slipped into her chair with a graceful flop, and I sat next to Mom, across from the happy couple. The turkey was dry, the stuffing underseasoned, but nobody mentioned it. Carol's food, like her family, was judged only by appearance. Everything was going fine until the second round of wine. That's when it happened. That's when Aunt Carol, cheeks flushed, leaned forward across the table, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Your sister's husband just bought her a yacht." Can you believe that? A yacht. Honestly, Rachel, when will someone finally spoil you? The room didn't go silent right away. It took about 3 seconds. 3 seconds for the laughter to die down, for Emily's smug smile to drop, for my mom's fork to pause halfway to her mouth. Carol tilted her head, half pity, half performance, as if she expected me to chuckle and wave it off. Tyler's face twisted into a grin, waiting for a punchline. But there wasn't one. Not from me. I picked up my napkin slowly, wiped the corner of my mouth with more calm than I felt, and said, "They did. I just don't post it on Facebook." And that was it. That was the moment the entire room froze. Tyler blinked. Emily sat back like I'd slapped her. Carol's mouth parted slightly, like she couldn't quite believe I'd spoken back, and Mom looked like she wanted to crawl under the table. No one knew what to say, which was rich coming from a table full of people who always had something to say about everyone else. The silence was thick and hungry. It lingered, chewed on the edges of the walls like a raccoon in the attic, making everyone so uncomfortable it was almost satisfying. I took another sip of wine, let the silence breathe a little longer, and smiled, Just a twitch, barely noticeable. Carol eventually tried to recover, laughing too hard, waving her hand like she hadn't just thrown a loaded grenade onto the dinner table. "Well, of course, dear," she said. "You've always been private." That word. Private. It was their polite way of saying irrelevant. Invisible. Not worth watching. It was the label they stuck on me when they couldn't figure out how I could afford to show up each year looking unbothered. When they couldn't understand how I lived alone in a 4-bedroom house, drove a Tesla, and still never seemed to need help or praise or attention. Because I never posted about it. I never bragged. I didn't need to. But they needed to know. Or maybe, deep down, I wanted them to. And that was the beginning. That one sentence, that one napkin wipe, cracked the whole facade. The rest of the night played out like a slow-motion car crash. Small glances. Tense shoulders. Wine refills no one asked for. Emily avoided my gaze. Tyler got louder. Carol tried to pivot the conversation to her garden renovation, but it was too late. The air had shifted. They started asking different questions after that. They started watching me, not with curiosity, but with suspicion. Like they finally realized the quiet one at the table had teeth, and she might have been keeping score. And they were right. I don't think people realize how cruelty can come in soft tones, in the form of smiles, well-meaning questions, and carefully chosen words that land like pinpricks rather than punches, building up over years until they become part of how you see yourself. Not because you believe them, but because you've heard them so often you start preparing for them before they're even spoken. That's what Thanksgiving always was for me. A stage where everyone else performed their highlight reels while I was cast as the extra, the one who always arrived on time, brought a thoughtful dish, dressed appropriately, and left without creating a stir. That role had been assigned to me so long ago I couldn't even remember if I ever auditioned for something else. After Aunt Carol's yacht comment and my response, the napkin, the deadpan line, the ice storm that followed, it felt like the table had shifted slightly, like everyone had leaned an inch back in their chairs without meaning to. Suddenly unsure of where I stood in the arrangement they'd all grown comfortable with. For years, I'd been the background, the reliable backdrop to Emily's center stage, the one who offered help quietly when things went wrong and applauded with a smile when someone else got the credit. But something about that sentence, they did. I just don't post it on Facebook, had changed the temperature, and for once, I wasn't the one shrinking into silence. Still, old roles are hard to unlearn. The rest of dinner passed in a weird mixture of overly polite chatter and pointed silence, as if everyone had received a memo not to press me further, but wasn't sure if they were allowed to ask why. Tyler leaned too far into his usual bravado, cracking jokes about the yacht he had no idea how to drive, as if he were trying to prove he wasn't rattled. Carol, always the emotional puppeteer, steered conversations toward neutral territory, recipes, weather, renovations, but kept side-eyeing me like she couldn't decide if I was about to explode or had already done so. My mother, God bless her, avoided direct conversation with me altogether, choosing instead to talk about a cousin's wedding, some friend's grandbaby, and a neighbor who had moved to Phoenix for health reasons, though she didn't specify what they were. She didn't ask what I meant by my comment, didn't press or scold, but I could see in the way she pursed her lips and fidgeted with her fork that she thought I had embarrassed her, that I had said something unnecessary, disruptive, out of place. It wasn't until we were clearing dishes and loading the dishwasher that Emily cornered me in the narrow hallway just off the kitchen. She touched my arm lightly, something she rarely did unless it was for show, and whispered, "What did you mean by that, Ratch?" Her tone wasn't angry, not exactly. It was quieter, laced with something between worry and accusation. Her eyes flicked over my face like she was searching for an explanation that wouldn't make her feel small. I looked at her for a long second before answering, and not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wasn't sure if I wanted to say it. The truth is, I had been biting my tongue for over a decade, letting Emily bask in the spotlight of her curated perfection, letting her soak up every ounce of attention our family had to offer, all while I worked long nights, made quiet investments, solved her problems without ever asking for thanks. But now, looking at her flawless makeup and anxious eyes, I realized she was standing on a crumbling pedestal, and part of her knew it. I said, "You know exactly what I meant." Her lips parted, but she didn't speak right away. I saw it in her eyes then, recognition or maybe dread. There was a flash of something raw, something she usually buried beneath spa photos and curated smiles. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "You didn't tell him, did you?" That was the moment the walls shifted again. I didn't answer. I just looked at her, let the silence do the work. Her hand dropped from my arm, and she stepped back like I'd slapped her. I watched her process what I didn't say, watched panic flicker across her face. She turned abruptly and walked back into the dining room, voice too high as she asked if anyone wanted coffee. The truth, of course, was messier than a simple yes or no. Years ago, when Tyler's newest investment imploded and he begged Emily not to tell the family how badly they were hemorrhaging money, it was me she called at 2 in the morning. It was me who wired them $40,000 with no questions asked. And it was me who made sure the wire came from a trust no one could trace, no name attached, no thank you expected. That wasn't the only time either. There had been others: credit card debts, mortgage payments, legal consultations for an unfortunate misunderstanding involving a former employee. Emily never asked directly after that first time. She just sent clipped texts or forwarded bills with no message. And I handled it. Silently. Not because I was a martyr. Not even because I loved her that much. But because it was easier than watching her fall apart in front of a family that would eat her alive for showing weakness. I had protected her, protected the illusion, because for some reason I believed that was what older sisters did, even when the world thought she was the successful one. That night, I drove home in silence. No music, no podcasts. Just the rhythmic swish of tires on cold pavement and the lingering echoes of that dinner table tension still settling in my chest. The headlights stretched across empty roads, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel guilty. I didn't feel like I'd said too much. If anything, I felt like I had finally said too little, and someone had finally noticed. And I couldn't stop thinking about what Emily had asked. "You didn't tell him, did you?" Because what if I did? Or what if I still might? There is a particular kind of performance that only families can master, the practiced choreography of pretending everything is fine when, beneath the surface, 1,000 cracks threaten to shatter the glass at any moment. At Thanksgiving, this dance becomes a tradition unto itself. Smiles that last too long, questions that avoid substance, stories shared not for connection but for validation. And perhaps no one performed this delicate theater more convincingly than my sister, Emily, who had learned to smile through ruin long before anyone realized ruin was even close. After that hallway confrontation, her question hanging between us like a splintered branch above a roof, I spent the following week thinking about her. Not about the version she paraded in front of family, not the Instagram filter she wore like armor, but the real woman behind all of it. I thought about the late-night calls she used to make back when Tyler had just started his third venture and their bank account balance didn't match the country club dues they insisted on paying. I remembered the way her voice would drop into a whisper even when she was alone in her house, terrified someone might overhear her admitting how scared she really was. She would talk to me in those moments, not as the older sister she resented for being distant, but as the only person who'd never asked her to prove anything. The first time she asked for help, she was so humiliated she could barely say the words. I had just gotten home from a client pitch that ran 2 hours over, still in heels and holding a takeout salad I didn't even want, when my phone rang at 1 in the morning. I answered without hesitation because I knew she wouldn't be calling unless something had gone terribly wrong. She didn't cry, not then. Emily never cried when it mattered, only later, when the damage was hidden. But she told me Tyler had made a bad call with a supplier in Miami, something about inventory issues and a temporary freeze on his assets, and if they didn't come up with nearly 40 grand by the end of the week, they'd lose the second property they'd just put under contract as a flip project. It wasn't just money, it was credibility, reputation, an image they had carefully curated like a porcelain dollhouse that had never known dust. I wired the money without hesitation. I didn't ask Tyler. I didn't even follow up. I just sent it through a private fund I managed under my consulting company, made sure there were no traces that could point back to me, and left it at that. She thanked me briefly, a day later. Never mentioned it again. But the thing about quiet help is that people forget where it came from. They start to think they pulled themselves out, that the boat steered straight because they held the wheel, not because someone was paddling like hell in the dark behind them. Over time, the asks became less desperate but more frequent, small amounts at first, then legal advice for a contractor dispute, then help finding someone to clean up a minor lawsuit that Tyler swore was nothing serious. She would text me from numbers I didn't recognize, burner phones used when she didn't want Tyler to see the messages. Once, she even drove 2 hours to meet me in a diner off the highway just to ask if I could pull some strings with a friend in the zoning department. I agreed, but each time I told myself it was the last. And maybe that's why her question at Thanksgiving had hit me harder than I expected. You didn't tell him, did you? Because deep down she knew the house of cards she lived in wasn't built by her husband's success, or her social media bravado, or the diamond ring she liked to flash at the dinner table. It was propped up by someone she rarely thanked, someone who never made it into her stories, someone she once told Carol was just doing okay. The irony was, I never wanted recognition. I didn't want to be her savior. I didn't even want her gratitude. I just wanted her to stop pretending I didn't exist. A few days after Thanksgiving, I texted her, told her I needed to talk. She said she was busy but could spare an hour between yoga and her hair appointment. I told her to meet me at the coffee shop near my office. When she arrived, she wore oversized sunglasses even though it was overcast, and she looked at me like I was about to drop a bomb. I pulled out my phone and tapped the screen a few times, then turned it toward her. The photo I showed her wasn't scandalous, wasn't violent, wasn't anything that would make headlines. It was a bank statement, one that showed a recent deposit into Tyler's company account, funds that had been flagged by a client of mine for suspicious routing. The deposit didn't come from me, but I recognized the shell company. It was one Tyler had used before to shuffle money offshore. Only this time, it wasn't just shady, it was potentially illegal. Her eyes widened slowly, and she whispered, "Where did you get this?" I didn't answer immediately. I let her sit with the weight of it, let her picture the possibilities: IRS audits, frozen assets, reputational ruin. Tyler's smug grin wiped off his face in front of the same country club members he bragged to weekly. Then I said, "You need to get out. Before it's too late." She looked at me like I'd slapped her. For a moment, I thought she might deny everything, pull out her usual defense mechanisms, accuse me of jealousy or meddling or bitterness. But she didn't. She just closed her eyes, rubbed her forehead, and said, "I don't think I know how." And in that moment, I saw her clearly, not the sister who had always one-upped me at family dinners, not the woman with the yacht and the curated life and the Pinterest-perfect holidays, but a person who had built her entire identity on lies she could no longer untangle. I didn't offer to fix it. Not this time. I just slid the phone back into my bag and said, "You will. Or you won't. Either way, I'm done hiding your mess." She didn't respond. She just sat there, hands trembling, watching me like someone who had finally realized the life raft was no longer behind her. And as I stood up to leave, I knew something had shifted again. Only this time, I wasn't the one holding the secret. She was. There's a certain satisfaction that comes not from revenge itself, but from the slow, deliberate buildup, the moment when all the pieces, which seemed unrelated or insignificant on their own, begin to fall into place like dominoes you've been setting up in plain sight while everyone around you assumed you were just fidgeting. For years, I kept my head down, nodded politely, brought salads to family functions, and let the spotlight shine where it always wanted to go on the loudest, flashiest, most demanding people in the room. I knew the game they were playing. I just never told them I'd been playing too. It's a strange thing, watching your family get drunk on their own illusions, especially when you've quietly spent years dismantling the scaffolding behind their perfect facades. Aunt Carol, with her carefully managed finances and her habit of giving unsolicited lectures about financial wisdom and fiscal discipline, had spent decades presenting herself as the responsible matriarch, The one who held the family together not just with casseroles and matching napkin rings, but with some imagined moral authority that no one dared challenge, not because we respected it, but because no one wanted to hear her sobbing into her own self-made narrative about being the unappreciated glue of the family. But behind her curated kitchen and her faux concern for everyone's well-being, Carol had been hiding something that, in hindsight, was almost laughably transparent. She had been siphoning funds from the family trust that my grandfather had left for emergencies only, a trust that was meant to be managed jointly by Carol and my mother, except, of course, Mom had long ago abdicated any real involvement in those matters, too eager to keep peace to ask questions, too passive to notice that her sister had quietly turned a shared responsibility into a solo project. I first noticed something was off about 4 years ago, back when I'd agreed, against my better judgment, to help Carol reconcile some end-of-year tax documents she said were just a little confusing. I don't know if she forgot that I spent most of my career consulting for corporate compliance firms, or if she simply assumed, as she always had, that I wouldn't look too closely. But I did. And what I found wasn't criminal, not at first glance, but it was messy. Transfers that didn't match any family need, withdrawals labeled as maintenance, that were clearly unrelated to the properties in question, and most damning of all, large, regular payments going to her son's business, a vape supply chain operation that had failed spectacularly in under 18 months. I didn't confront her. Not then. Not because I was scared, but because it was more useful to keep watching. Every year, I'd ask quiet questions under the guise of curiosity, offer to help with the books in ways that seemed like favors, not inspections. I built a folder over time, carefully, methodically, documenting everything from wire transfers to fabricated invoices. The woman who spent decades treating me like an underachiever never once considered that I might be building a case against her while she bragged about someone else's yacht. I hadn't planned to reveal anything during Thanksgiving. That wasn't my original intention. The line about Facebook wasn't a calculated move, it just slipped out, a moment of emotional fatigue that cracked my usual restraint. But once it happened, once I saw the room still and heavy with the weight of a truth no one could name, something in me shifted. Not rage, not even vengeance, just clarity. So, a few days after I met with Emily, I made a decision. I went into the attic, where I kept my old files, and pulled out the binder I'd labeled Carol, Discrepancies. It was thick, heavier than I remembered, filled with spreadsheets, statements, emails she'd forwarded without thinking. I printed out the key pages, not because I intended to hand them out like pamphlets at a protest, but because I wanted them physically in my hands when I confronted her, something tangible I could set down on her perfect table like a mirror she couldn't avoid. I called her that Wednesday, told her I wanted to come by and bring over some leftover dishes I hadn't gotten around to delivering on Thanksgiving, knowing full well she'd never turn down an opportunity to gloat about how beautifully everything had gone. When I arrived, she ushered me in with her usual performative hospitality, pouring tea into china cups that no one actually liked drinking from and lighting a cinnamon candle that gave me a headache the moment I stepped inside. We sat in the living room, the same one where, a few days earlier, she'd tried to shame me with a smile, and I let her ramble for a bit, about how the turkey was just the right texture this year, how Emily's new watch was absolutely to die for, and how Tyler was apparently considering investing in a winery, out west, though she wasn't sure exactly where. When she paused to ask how I'd been, her voice laced with exaggerated concern, I took the folder out of my bag and placed it gently on the coffee table. "What's this?" she asked, reaching for it with a chuckle, like I'd just handed her a forgotten birthday card. "It's everything," I said, calmly. "Every withdrawal, every misused cent, every cover story you spun to make it look like maintenance or repairs. It's all there, Carol." She didn't speak right away. Her hand froze on the folder, and her face shifted first to confusion, then to understanding, then to fear. Not loud fear, not the kind that makes someone scream or protest, but the quiet kind that comes when a person realizes their lies have reached the end of the road and there's no off-ramp in sight. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she finally said, her voice brittle. "I'm not doing anything," I replied. But I thought you should know that I've sent digital copies of this to Mom and to the Trust's financial advisor. If you want to explain things, now is the time." Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder, flipping through the first few pages with wide, darting eyes. She didn't cry. Carol never cried in front of people. It wasn't part of her performance toolkit. But she looked like she'd aged 10 years in 10 seconds, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel sorry for her. As I stood to leave, she asked, "Why now?" I didn't look back when I said, "Because Facebook isn't the battlefield. Real life is. And I stopped letting you win it a long time ago, you just didn't notice." I walked out without another word. Outside, the air was colder than I expected, sharp against my skin, but it felt like the right kind of cold, the kind that clears your head instead of numbing your senses. And in that moment, I realized something else. The person I'd been pretending to be at those family gatherings, the quiet one, the afterthought, the invisible support beam, that person was gone. All that remained now was the woman who had watched them build their fragile kingdom on sand. And who had finally decided to let the tide in. There's a moment before you strike, not the kind of strike that draws blood, but the kind that severs something deeper, something that's been festering beneath the surface for years, when time seems to slow, when the air itself feels thick with the weight of everything unspoken. It doesn't matter how long you've rehearsed it in your mind or how calm you appear on the outside. When the moment arrives, it always hits harder than you expect. And yet, by the time it comes, you're no longer asking for permission or forgiveness or understanding. You're simply done. In the days leading up to what would become my final Thanksgiving with them, I could feel a shift, not just in me, but in the way they looked at me, spoke to me, maneuvered around me like I'd become something unfamiliar, possibly dangerous. The woman they had dismissed for so long had disrupted the fragile hierarchy they'd so carefully maintained. And despite their attempts to return to normal, to plaster over the cracks with Instagram photos and shallow phone calls, I knew that underneath it all, they were nervous. Not because they thought I might expose them, but because I already had, and they didn't yet know how much I planned to say. The invitation came, as it always did, in Carol's usual overly formal tone, a group text carefully worded to sound warm but efficient, announcing the time, menu contributions, and seating arrangements as if she were organizing a board meeting, not a family dinner. No one mentioned the folder I'd handed her weeks earlier. No one brought up the fact that my mother, after reading every single page, had quietly called me to say she was disappointed but not surprised. And Emily, for all her dramatic flair, had gone completely silent since our coffee shop meeting, as if she had folded herself back into the safety of denial. I could have ignored the invitation. I could have packed a bag, booked a flight, and disappeared for the weekend to somewhere with sun, silence, and a bar that served better wine. But I didn't. Not because I wanted to gloat, or because I thought they deserved an explanation. I went because I wanted to be present when the dust finally settled, to look them all in the eyes and make sure they saw the person they had spent so long pretending wasn't worth seeing. The house was the same, too many candles, too many decorative pumpkins, too many forced smiles. But the atmosphere was different, brittle, like a stage set built too quickly, one strong gust away from collapsing. Carol greeted me with the kind of hug people give when they're trying to prove something to someone else in the room, and I let her do it without returning the gesture. Emily was already seated, sipping white wine and wearing the same brand of expensive detachment that had gotten her through so many family gatherings before, but her eyes betrayed her, darting, uncertain, waiting for whatever it was she feared I might do. Dinner began the same way it always did, with Carol's rigid toast, a few limp jokes from Tyler, and my mother clinking her fork against her glass to urge everyone to be grateful for what we have. And I was. I was grateful that I had nothing left to lose. I stood slowly, not dramatically, not with a flourish, but with the calm precision of someone who's prepared their whole life for a single moment of truth. All eyes turned toward me, some wary, some smug, some pretending to be indifferent, and I held their gaze for a long, deliberate breath before I spoke. "I've been thinking a lot lately," I began, my voice steady but sharp, "about what it means to be part of a family that celebrates the loudest voice in the room, no matter what it's saying, and ignores the quiet ones, even when they're screaming inside. A few eyes widened. Carol smiled too quickly, too wide, already sensing the wrong kind of speech coming her way, but unsure how to interrupt without looking guilty. I want to give thanks, too, I continued, pacing my words so slowly it made them squirm, but not for the yacht, or the remodeled kitchen, or the curated lives we all pretend are real. I want to give thanks to the silence, the kind that lets people rewrite history while the rest of us just eat our cranberry sauce and pretend not to notice. I want to thank the moments I stayed quiet when I should have spoken up, the times I gave without being asked, and the years I spent making sure someone else's life didn't fall apart while they stood in front of this very table and took all the credit. Emily flinched. Carol coughed. Tyler leaned back in his chair like he was watching a tennis match he didn't understand. But mostly, I said, setting down my wine glass, I want to thank you all for showing me exactly who you are. Because this year, I finally realized that I don't need to belong to a table that only makes room for people who shine the way you want them to shine. I let the silence bloom. It wasn't the shocked, frozen silence from before. It was heavier, darker, the kind that carries consequences. No one dared speak. Even the clink of silverware had stopped. I didn't need to raise my voice. I didn't need to name names, to drop facts, to unravel each thread of betrayal and selfishness, because they already knew. I had given them all the information they needed, the trust violations, the financial cover-ups, the lies they told each other and themselves. What they did with it now was their burden. I looked at Emily one last time. She met my eyes and held them, and for the first time in years, she didn't try to smile. She looked scared. Not of me, but of the life she'd built, the truth behind every filtered photo and diamond-studded distraction. I didn't feel anger. I felt release. I turned, stepped away from the table, and walked toward the door. No one followed. No one called out. Outside, the air was cold again, but not biting. It felt clean, bracing, like the first breath after surfacing from deep water. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I hadn't planned beyond that moment. But I knew one thing, whatever came next, it would be mine. Not shared, not hidden, not done for someone else's benefit. Mine. As I pulled out of the driveway, I saw my mother standing in the window, her expression unreadable. Maybe she finally understood what I had been carrying all those years. Or maybe she was just wondering what would happen now that the quiet one had stopped playing along. And maybe that's the part that will haunt them the most, not what I said, or what I revealed, or what I proved, but the simple, terrifying fact that I had always been capable of this, and they had never once seen it coming.